The trumpet hits a flat note. It's barely audible, a fraction of a second, a breath of imperfection in a sea of sound. But Frank Sinatra hears it. He always hears it. It's Saturday night at the Copa Cabana in New York City, 1956. The room is packed. 800 people in silk dresses and tailored suits. Cigarette smoke curling toward the chandeliers, champagne glasses catching the light. Frank is mid-verse on "I've Got You Under My Skin," his voice wrapping around the melody like velvet around steel. And then he stops. The band keeps playing for 3 more bars before they realize. The trumpet player, a young man named Eddie Condon, looks up from his sheet music. His face goes white, because Frank Sinatra is staring directly at him. Frank doesn't say a word. He just places the microphone on the piano. The room falls silent. And then Frank Sinatra does something that will be whispered about in every nightclub, every recording studio, every back room in the entertainment industry for the next 50 years. He fires his entire band, on stage, in front of 800 witnesses. What happened next would reveal the dark side of genius, and what those musicians whispered to each other backstage would change how the industry understood Frank Sinatra forever. To understand what happened that night at the Copa Cabana, you need to understand Frank Sinatra in 1956. This wasn't the young crooner who made teenage girls faint at the Paramount Theater. This wasn't the broken man who lost his voice at this very club 6 years earlier, coughing blood into his handkerchief while his career crumbled around him. This was the new Frank Sinatra, the Phoenix. In 1953, he had won an Academy Award for From Here to Eternity. He had signed with Capitol Records and released albums that critics called masterpieces, songs for young lovers, Swing Easy. In the wee small hours, each one more perfect than the last, each one a testament to his obsession with getting every note, every breath, every silence exactly right. The entertainment world of the 1950 seconds was different. Recording sessions were live, no computers to fix mistakes, no overdubs to patch the holes. You walked into the studio with 40 musicians, and you either got it right or you started over. And Frank Sinatra got it right, almost always on the first take. His collaborators called him a perfectionist. His arrangers called him a genius. His musicians called him something else entirely, but only when he wasn't in the room. Nelson Riddle, the arranger who helped create Sinatra's signature sound, once said, "Frank's intuitions about tempo, phrasing, and configuration are amazingly right. His taste is impeccable." But Riddle also admitted something darker. His collaborators approached him with uneasiness because of his unpredictable and often volatile temperament. That temperament had been building for weeks before the Copacabana incident. Frank was recording a new album. He was filming a movie. He was performing 6 nights a week. He was sleeping 4 hours a night and drinking more than he should, and he was surrounded by people who were afraid to tell him no. The pressure was enormous. Every performance had to be perfect. Every note had to land. Because Frank Sinatra didn't make mistakes. Frank Sinatra was the standard by which everyone else was measured. And on the night of the incident, that standard was about to break something. The band that night was a collection of some of the finest session musicians in New York. 22 men who had played with the biggest names in jazz and popular music. They had recorded with Sinatra before. They knew his reputation. They knew the rules. Rule 1. Be early. Frank hated waiting. Rule 2. Know your part cold. Frank never rehearsed twice. Rule 3. If Frank gives you a look, you've already made a mistake. The trumpet player, Eddie Condon, was 26 years old. He had been playing professionally since he was 17. He was good. Everyone said so. But on this particular night, he was also nervous. His wife was pregnant with their first child. He had been up all night with her at the hospital, a false alarm that left him exhausted and distracted. He shouldn't have played that night. He knew it. But you didn't cancel on Frank Sinatra. You showed up. You performed. You prayed. You didn't make a mistake. The band leader was a man named Johnny Mandel, a respected arranger who had worked with Sinatra for years. Mandel understood Frank better than most. He knew that beneath the perfectionism was something else: fear. Frank Sinatra was terrified of being mediocre, terrified of going back to those dark years when nobody wanted to hear him sing, terrified of proving that the comeback was just a fluke, That fear made him great. It also made him dangerous. And standing in the wings that night, watching everything unfold, was a young woman named Gloria. She was a Copa girl, one of the dancers who performed between sets. She had been working at the club for 3 months. She had never spoken to Frank Sinatra. But she would be the one who heard what the musicians whispered to each other after everything fell apart. The trouble started before Frank even took the stage. During the sound check that afternoon, he had asked for the brass section to be repositioned. The sound wasn't blending right, he said. The trumpets were overpowering the strings. Johnny Mandel made the adjustment, but Frank still wasn't satisfied. "It sounds muddy," Frank said, his voice flat, "like we're playing in a bathtub." The sound engineer ran through the levels again. Frank listened with his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to the left, the way he always listened when he was searching for something wrong. "Better," he finally said, "but watch the third trumpet. He's pushing." Eddie Condon felt his stomach tighten. Third trumpet. That was him. The first set that night went smoothly. Frank opened with "Come Fly With Me," moved through "The Lady Is a Tramp," and had the audience eating out of his hand by the time he reached "Witchcraft." He was charming. He was funny. He told jokes between songs and made eye contact with women in the front row. But those who knew him could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened between smiles. Something was bothering him. During the break, Johnny Mandel pulled Eddie aside. "You okay, kid? You seem off tonight." "I'm fine," Eddie lied. "Just tired." "Well, wake up." Frank's in one of his moods. You don't want to be the one who sets him off. The second set began at 11:30 p.m. The room was louder now, the audience drunk and happy. Frank walked out to thunderous applause. He picked up the microphone and smiled. "Let's slow things down a little," he said. "This next one is special to me. One fretting of while." End quote. One fretting of while. The band began "I've Got You Under My Skin." The arrangement was complex, building from a soft opening to a dramatic crescendo. It required precision. It required every musician to be locked in, breathing together, moving together. For the first minute, everything was perfect. And then Eddie Condon, exhausted and distracted, came in a half beat early on his entrance. His note was slightly flat, barely noticeable to anyone in the audience. But to Frank Sinatra, who had spent his entire career training his ear to detect the smallest imperfection, it was like a gunshot. Frank's eyes snapped to Eddie. The singing continued for 3 more bars, but something had changed. The warmth was gone from his voice. The performance was now a test, and Eddie Condon was failing. Frank stopped singing. The band played on for a moment, confused. Then, one by one, the instruments fell silent. The room went quiet. 800 people stared at the stage, champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Frank placed the microphone on the piano. He looked at the band, not at Eddie specifically, at all of them. "Stop," he said. His voice was calm. That was the terrifying part. Johnny Mandel stepped forward. "Frank, what's?" I said stop. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear ice melting in glasses. You could hear the hum of the stage lights. Frank walked to the edge of the stage and looked out at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I apologize, but I can't give you a performance that isn't up to my standards, and right now this isn't up to my standards." He turned back to the band, 22 men in tuxedos, holding instruments that suddenly felt very heavy. "You're done," Frank said. "All of you. Pack up. Go home." Johnny Mandel's face went pale. "Frank, you can't just—" "I can do whatever I want. This is my show, my name on the marquee, my reputation on the line, and I will not stand up here and let you make me sound like some 2-bit lounge singer at a hotel bar." Eddie Condon stood frozen, his trumpet still raised to his lips. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain about his wife, about the hospital, about the sleepless night, but the words wouldn't come. Frank walked across the stage, past the piano, past the drums, until he was standing directly in front of Eddie. "You know what separates the professionals from the amateurs?" Frank asked quietly. Quiet enough that only Eddie could hear. "The professionals show up ready, every time, no excuses." Eddie lowered his trumpet. Mr. Sinatra, I'm sorry, Saster. Save it, save it, save it. Frank turned and walked off the stage. The Copa's manager came running. The audience began to murmur, and 22 musicians stood under the lights, their careers suddenly uncertain, wondering what had just happened. The show was canceled. The audience was given refunds, and Frank Sinatra locked himself in his dressing room and didn't come out for 3 hours. What happened that night at the Copa Cabana spread through the music industry like wildfire. By the next morning, every musician in New York knew the story. Frank Sinatra had fired his entire band mid-concert, over a single flat note, over a half-beat mistake. The message was clear. Perfection wasn't a goal for Frank Sinatra. It was the minimum requirement. Some musicians refused to work with him after that night. They said he was a tyrant. They said no song was worth that kind of humiliation. They said the man had lost perspective. But others understood something different. Frank Sinatra didn't fire those musicians because he was cruel. He fired them because he was afraid that one mistake would lead to another. Afraid that the cracks would spread. Afraid that if he let one imperfection slide, he would slide right back into obscurity. Eddie Condon never played a major venue again. He took a job teaching music at a high school in New Jersey. When reporters asked him about the incident years later, he always said the same thing. Frank wasn't wrong. I wasn't ready that night. I should have stayed home. The mistake I made was thinking I could fool him. 1-6. Johnny Mandel continued to work with Sinatra, but their relationship was never the same. Frank pushed people hard. Mandel once said, sometimes too hard, but he pushed himself harder than anyone. That's what people didn't see. And Gloria, the Copa girl who had watched everything from the wings? She had heard what the musicians whispered to each other as they packed up their instruments backstage. Years later, she finally revealed what they said. They weren't angry, Gloria recalled. That's what surprised me. They were sad. One of them, the trombone player, I think, he said, Frank doesn't know how to forgive himself. That's the real problem. He can't forgive himself for ever being less than perfect. So he can't forgive anyone else either. In the years that followed, Frank Sinatra would go on to record some of the greatest albums in popular music history. He would win Grammys. He would sell millions of records. He would become the chairman of the board. But he never talked about that night at the Copa Cabana. When interviewers brought it up, he would change the subject. When friends mentioned it, he would leave the room. It was as if the incident had been erased from his memory. Or perhaps it was too painful to remember. The night when Frank Sinatra's pursuit of perfection destroyed something he could never rebuild. Perfection is a seductive lie. It promises that if you work hard enough, if you practice long enough, if you demand enough from yourself and everyone around you, you can achieve something flawless, something untouchable, something that will last forever. Has-been, this isn't, flying give. Frank Sinatra believed that lie. He built his entire career on it, and in many ways, it made him the greatest popular singer of the 20th century. His recordings are still studied. His phrasing is still imitated. His standards are still the standards by which everyone else is measured. But perfection has a price, and that night at the Copa Cabana, we saw what that price looks like. 22 musicians humiliated in front of 800 people. One young trumpet player whose career was destroyed over a single note, a genius so terrified of failure that he couldn't extend grace to anyone, including himself. The pursuit of excellence is noble. The obsession with perfection is something else entirely. It's a kind of prison, a cage you build around yourself, one impossible standard at a time. Frank Sinatra spent his entire life trying to be perfect, and he came closer than almost anyone ever has. But in the end, even he couldn't outrun the truth that those musicians whispered backstage. The man who couldn't forgive a single flat note had never learned to forgive himself. This is the story they don't tell you about Frank Sinatra. Not the glamour, not the fame, not the voice that could break your heart with a single phrase, but the cost. The relentless, unforgiving cost of trying to be perfect in a world that wasn't built for perfection. This was Frank Sinatra, Legacy Confidential. If this story changed how you see the chairman of the board, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves music. we're just getting started. There are stories about the Rat Pack, about the mob, about the women who loved him, and the friends who feared him. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Leave a comment below and tell us, what do you think matters more, being perfect or being kind? Is excellence worth the price if it costs you your humanity? Until next time, keep swinging, Pally.